Waitress gave her umbrella to a homeless man. Days later, a lawyer knocked on her door. But the documents he carried exposed a millionaire's lies, leaving everyone stunned and gasping. But before we begin, subscribe now, or this might be our last meeting. Follow, comment, and share to stay connected. Don't miss out. Let's dive in. The neon sign of Rainy Street Diner flickered against the darkness, casting erratic shadows across the wet pavement. Clara Evans pushed through the glass door, the bell's tired chime announcing her departure into the night. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, already feeling the cold bite through the worn fabric. 11 hours on her feet, and her lower back throbbed with that familiar ache she'd learned to ignore years ago. The storm had been building all evening, threatening through the windows as she'd refilled coffee cups and smiled at customers who never quite met her eyes. Now it unleashed itself fully, rain hammering down in sheets, wind howling through the empty streets like something alive and angry. The streetlights trembled, their glow struggling against the deluge. Clara's fingers found the umbrella in her bag, the metal handle cold and reassuring. It wasn't much, a cheap thing she'd bought at a convenience store 3 years ago, but it was hers. She started to open it when movement caught her eye. Beneath the diner's awning, barely visible in the shadows, an elderly man huddled against the brick wall. His clothes hung heavy with water, plastered to his thin frame. He was shaking, not the subtle tremble of cold, but the violent shudder of a body approaching its limit. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, gripped his knees as if trying to hold himself together. Clara's hand froze on the umbrella. She should keep walking. She should protect herself first. That's what 5 years of survival had taught her. The city was full of people who needed help, and she couldn't save them all. She could barely save herself. But something in the way he sat there, trying to make himself smaller, invisible, she recognized that posture. She'd worn it herself once, in the days after everything fell apart. Her feet moved before her mind finished deciding. She crossed the few steps between them, rain already soaking through her jacket, plastering her dark hair to her face. Here, she held out the umbrella. The old man looked up, his eyes clouded with exhaustion but still sharp enough to register surprise. Water dripped from his silver beard, and for a moment, he just stared at her offering. "Take it," Clara said, her voice firm but gentle. "You need it more than I do." His weathered hand reached out slowly, as if he'd forgotten how to accept kindness. When his fingers closed around the handle, Clara saw them tremble, not just from cold now, but something else. Emotion, maybe. Recognition of an unexpected grace. "Still exists," he said, his voice rough as gravel, barely audible above the storm. "Just people in this world." The words hit her harder than they should have. Clara managed a small smile, already backing away before the tightness in her chest could become something more. "Stay dry." Then she turned and ran. The rain attacked her immediately, ice-cold needles against her skin. Within seconds, she was soaked through, her jacket useless, her clothes clinging uncomfortably, water squishing in her worn sneakers with each step. But she didn't slow down. The cold was clarifying, almost cleansing. It gave her something physical to focus on, instead of the unexpected warmth that small interaction had sparked inside her. 4 blocks from the diner, Clara's apartment building rose ahead, a structure that had probably been nice once, decades ago. Now it was just tired, like everything else in this neighborhood. But as she ran, her route took her past a different kind of building entirely. Price and Hale LLP occupied a sleek glass tower that seemed to mock everything around it. Even in the storm, it glowed with prosperity, its windows bright with the light of people who worked late because their careers mattered, because they were building something, becoming something. Clara's steps faltered. She couldn't help it. 5 years, and that name still made her stomach turn. Hale. Richard Hale, who'd stood in a courtroom and destroyed her with a smile, who'd taken her reputation, her career, her future, and crushed them under the weight of lies so polished they'd shone like truth. The nausea rose fast and familiar. She forced herself to keep moving, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at the building anymore. Some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to stay quiet until something reminded them they were there. Her apartment welcomed her with silence. Clara hung her dripping jacket on the hook by the door, then her apron, the stained, coffee-scented symbol of what her life had become. The fabric swung gently, and she stared at it for a long moment, at the name tag that read simply, Clara, with no last name, no history, No story worth telling. She moved through the small space on autopilot. One bedroom, tiny kitchen, bathroom with a door that didn't quite close. On the dresser, half hidden behind a stack of utility bills she couldn't quite afford, sat a leather folder. Clara picked it up with careful hands, the way you'd hold something fragile and dangerous at the same time. She opened it slowly. Her law degree looked back at her. The paper was still crisp, the gold seal still bright. Clara Evans, Juris Doctor. It felt like looking at a photograph of someone who'd died, someone she used to be in another lifetime. The tears came quietly, just a few escaping before she caught them. She'd learned not to cry loudly. The walls were thin, and Mrs. Chen next door worried too much already. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, closed the folder with deliberate care, and slid it back into its hiding place. The silence settled around her again, broken only by the rain against the window. She should eat something, should change into dry clothes, should do any number of practical things that would constitute taking care of herself. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, still dripping, and let the exhaustion wash over her. Outside, beneath the awning where Clara had found him, the old man stood with the umbrella held carefully over his head. But he wasn't looking at the shelter it provided. His eyes were fixed on the Price and Hale building, on those bright windows that promised justice for those who could afford it. His expression was bitter, carved deep with years of knowing things he wished he didn't. The umbrella trembled slightly in his grip, not from weakness now, but from the force of memory, of anger held carefully in check. Above them both, thunder rolled across the city like a warning. The storm wasn't finished yet. In fact, it was only beginning. The past was returning, dragging everything buried with it back into the light. 2 days after the storm, Clara was measuring coffee grounds when someone knocked on her door. Not the tentative tap of a neighbor or the impatient pound of a delivery person. This was something else. Firm, measured, professional. The knock of someone who expected to be answered. She glanced at the clock. 9 in the morning on her day off, and she was still in her pajama pants and an old t-shirt. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a dark suit, holding a leather briefcase that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Clara's hand hesitated on the deadbolt. Every instinct she'd developed over 5 years of staying invisible told her not to open that door. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, like the pull of a scar you can't stop touching, made her unlock it. The man was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with sharp features and eyes that cataloged everything in quick, efficient sweeps. When he looked at her, she felt assessed and categorized in the space of a heartbeat. Clara Evans? His voice matched his appearance. Smooth, educated, expensive. Who's asking? She kept her hand on the door, ready to close it. Alexander Price. He reached into his jacket with practiced ease, producing a business card. Price and Hale LLP. I need a moment of your time. The world tilted slightly. Clara's fingers tightened on the door until her knuckles went white, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of waitressing had taught her to hide reactions, to smile through anything. Alexander pulled an envelope from his briefcase, thick paper, the kind that whispered money and power. The firm's logo was embossed on the front. Price and Hale LLP, the ampersand styled like scales of justice. The irony would have been funny if it didn't make her want to vomit. You're required to appear for clarification regarding the case of Hale versus State. He held out the envelope, his tone professional, but not unkind. The deposition is scheduled for Hale versus State. Clara's voice came out flat, empty. She didn't take the envelope. Something flickered across Alexander's face. Recognition, maybe, of a reaction that didn't match the situation. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with new attention. Yes, we're reopening certain aspects of the investigation, and your name appeared in the preliminary. My name? She laughed, and it sounded wrong even to her own ears. Of course it did. It always does, doesn't it? Whenever someone needs a convenient scapegoat. The blood had drained from her face. She could feel the cold spreading through her chest, down her arms. 5 years. She'd rebuilt something resembling a life, brick by painful brick, and now this man stood at her door with that name, Hale, and the past was rushing back like water through a broken dam. Alexander's professional mask slipped for just a second. He saw the panic, the way her breathing had gone shallow, the tremor in her hands. Something in his expression shifted, not quite concern, but close enough to make him uncomfortable with his own presence. Ms. Evans. If you have concerns about the proceedings, you're entitled to legal representation. I can provide you with a list of, I know my rights. The words came out sharper than Clara intended, edged with the kind of precision that made Alexander's head tilt slightly. Under the Sixth Amendment, I have the right to counsel. Under discovery rules, I'm entitled to review any evidence pertinent to my testimony. And under ethical guidelines, you're required to disclose any potential conflicts of interest before this conversation proceeds further. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Alexander's carefully maintained professional expression cracked completely, replaced by open surprise. His eyes swept over her again, not assessing now, but reevaluating. Taking in the tiny apartment, the coffee-stained apron hanging by the door, the woman in pajama pants who just rattled off legal terminology like she'd been born speaking it. You're not just a waitress, he said slowly. Clara's smile was bitter. I'm exactly a waitress. That's what happens when someone like Hale decides you're inconvenient. You become whatever you can survive being. She reached out and took the envelope from his hand, her fingers steady now despite the storm raging inside her. The paper felt heavy, weighted with everything it represented. Is that all, Mr. Price? Or did you want to witness the full extent of my humiliation? See where the mighty have fallen? Her voice was cold, controlled, the voice she'd used in courtrooms once, before they'd stripped that away from her too. Because I charge for entertainment, and you're not my type of clientele. Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in the conversation, he looked uncertain, like he'd expected a simple service call and instead stumbled into something complicated and morally ambiguous. His hand tightened on his briefcase. Nothing that firm touches is just, Clara said quietly, meeting his eyes with the kind of directness that made him want to look away. Remember that when you go back to your glass tower and your partners ask how this conversation went? Remember that you work for a man who destroys people like it's a sport. She stepped back and started to close the door. Ms. Evans, Alexander's hand moved as if to stop her, but he caught himself. I apologize if this was. I'm just doing my job. So was I. Clara's expression didn't soften. Once. The door clicked shut with quiet finality. Alexander stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the scuffed wood. Behind him, the building's fluorescent lights hummed and flickered. The air smelled like old cooking and disappointment. He'd conducted 1,000 of these notifications. Most people were confused, some were angry, a few were scared. But this felt different, wrong. Like he'd just delivered a summons to someone who already knew the verdict, who'd already been convicted by the same system that was now demanding her cooperation. The guilt that twisted in his chest made no sense. He was a lawyer. He followed procedures. He delivered documents and maintained professional boundaries. He didn't question whether the people he worked for were good or bad. That wasn't his job. So why did his hand shake slightly as he tucked the briefcase under his arm? Alexander walked down the 3 flights of stairs, his mind replaying the conversation. The legal knowledge she'd displayed, the way she'd said Hale's name like it physically hurt her, the controlled fury behind her professional courtesy. Clara Evans wasn't just familiar with the legal system, she'd been part of it. And somehow, Hale had been involved in taking that away from her. He pushed through the building's front door into the bright morning. Across the street, partially hidden by a parked van, an elderly man sat on a bus stop bench. He wasn't waiting for a bus. The way he watched Alexander exit the building made that clear. Their eyes met for just a second. The old man's expression was knowing, almost sad, like he'd witnessed this exact scene play out before, and knew exactly how it would end. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He turned toward his car, walking faster than necessary, trying to shake the feeling that he'd just become part of something he didn't understand but probably should. Behind him, the old man stood slowly, carefully, still holding the cheap umbrella like it was made of gold. His gaze moved from the lawyer's retreating figure to the window 3 floors up, where a silhouette stood watching. The storm was building again. Not rain this time, but something bigger. Something that had been 5 years in the making. Alexander told himself he was just getting coffee. That's what he repeated as he pushed through the door of Rainy Street Diner 3 days after delivering the summons. The bell chimed above his head, announcing his presence to the handful of customers scattered across worn booths. The place smelled like grease and burnt coffee, with an underlying note of pine cleaner. Red vinyl seats were patched with duct tape. The floor had been mopped so many times the pattern had faded to suggestions of what it once was. Clara stood behind the counter, her back to him, reaching for a coffee pot. She wore the standard uniform, but something about the way she carried herself set her apart. Her posture was too straight, too controlled, like someone who'd been trained to command a room and couldn't quite forget how. Alexander slid onto a stool at the counter. When Clara turned, coffee pot in hand, her expression didn't change. No surprise, no anger. She'd known he was there the moment the bell rang. Coffee? Her voice was professionally neutral. Please. She poured without looking at him, the stream hitting the center of the cup with practiced precision. Not a drop spilled. Alexander watched her move down the counter, refilling cups, taking orders, delivering plates. She spoke to customers with polite warmth that never quite reached her eyes, but it was the way she spoke that caught his attention. Clear diction, no dropped consonants. When an older woman asked about the daily special, Clara's explanation was articulate, organized, hitting key points in logical sequence. A man in a construction vest made a crude joke. Clara's smile stayed pleasant, but something flickered in her eyes. Assessment, dismissal, calculation of whether this required management. She diffused it with a practiced phrase and moved on. Alexander had seen that look before, in courtrooms, in depositions, in the eyes of lawyers deciding whether to object or let something slide. 40 minutes later, Clara approached with his check. Alexander pulled out his wallet, leaving a generous tip. Can I offer you a ride home? It looks like rain again. I'm fine. She didn't even pretend to consider it. Ms. Evans, I just wanted to... I said I'm fine, Mr. Price. Her eyes met his directly. Have a good evening. She disappeared through the kitchen door before he could respond. Alexander gathered his briefcase and headed out. Outside, dusk was settling over the street. He'd just reached his car when raised voices caught his attention. 2 buildings down, near an alley entrance, he saw the elderly man from the bus stop. 2 security guards had him cornered against a brick wall, one gesturing aggressively. Told you before, we don't want your kind here, the first guard was saying. You're bad for the neighborhood. The old man held that same cheap umbrella, using it almost like a cane. He didn't argue, just stood there with a dignity that seemed out of place given his threadbare clothes. I'm not causing trouble, just trying to stay dry. You're trespassing. Now move, or we'll make you move. Another voice cut through the confrontation, sharp, clear, carrying unmistakable authority. He's not trespassing. Clara stood at the alley entrance, still wearing her apron, but her entire demeanor had shifted. This is a public sidewalk, which means he has every right to be here. What you're doing constitutes harassment under Municipal Code 942, and if you persist, it becomes assault. Both guards turned to stare. The one with the radio recovered first. Lady, this isn't your business. Actually, it became my business the moment you violated this man's civil rights within my line of sight. Clara moved closer, positioning herself between them. I suggest you return to your duties before I file a formal complaint with your employer and the city licensing board. The authority in her voice was absolute. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, thrown by the disconnect between her appearance and her words. Whatever, not worth the hassle. They retreated down the street. Clara watched them go, then turned to the old man, her features softening. Are you all right? More than all right. He smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. Thanks to you, twice now. I'm just Clara. She offered her hand. Eli. He took it gently. And I owe my life to your kindness that night in the rain. Alexander moved closer, drawn by recognition. The old man noticed him approaching. Their eyes met, and Eli's expression shifted, knowing, almost amused. Judge Elias Thornton, Alexander said slowly. You disappeared from the bench 4 years ago. Everyone thought you were... dead? Eli finished. Some things are worse than death, Mr. Price. Like watching the system you served become a tool for those who corrupt it. Clara looked between them, confusion flickering across her features. Alexander's mind was racing. The timing, the connection, the impossibility that felt too precise to be coincidence. You two know each other? Clara asked. We've never met, Eli said. But I know his firm, and I suspect Mr. Price here is beginning to understand there's more to certain stories than his partners told him. Ms. Evans, I think we should... No. Clara's expression closed like a door. Whatever this is, I'm not interested. Thank you for the concern, Mr. Price, but I need to get back to work. She walked away before either man could respond. Alexander watched her go, then looked at Eli, who was studying him with eyes that had seen too much. She's innocent, Eli said quietly. She was always innocent. But by the time I could have helped her, I was already gone. What does that mean? It means you should start asking questions about the case files you carry, particularly the ones with Richard Hale's signature. Eli adjusted his grip on the umbrella. I'll be around when you're ready to hear answers that will cost you everything you've built. He walked away slowly, leaving Alexander alone on the darkening street with more questions than answers and a growing suspicion that he'd been working for the wrong side of something important. That night, Alexander sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He'd pulled Clara Evans's name through the firm's database, digging into archived files he normally wouldn't access without approval. What he found made his hands shake. Employment records showed Clara terminated for alleged misconduct, but buried in the metadata were inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, signatures that looked slightly off. He pulled up signature verification software, fed in samples from Clara's termination documents, ran the analysis. Forgery detected. Probability 94%. Alexander cross-referenced the forged signatures, tracing them back through the digital trail. Every single one had been created, approved, or filed by Richard Hale. Alexander's printer hummed in the empty office, spitting out pages that felt heavier than paper should. He gathered them carefully, sliding the evidence into a manila folder he locked in his briefcase. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. 3 a.m. The city glittered beyond his window, indifferent to the corruptions happening in buildings just like this one. Alexander had always loved working late. The silence, the focus. Now the silence felt complicit. He stared at his computer screen. The forged signatures glowed accusingly. He should bring this to someone. The managing partners, the ethics board. But every official channel ran through Richard Hale. Morning came too quickly. Alexander barely slept. He arrived at 7, made coffee he didn't drink, rehearsed conversations he wasn't sure he'd have. By 9, when Hale typically arrived, his nerves were strung tight. Richard Hale swept into the building like he owned it. Expensive suit, perfect hair, confident smile. He nodded at Alexander in passing, already focused on his phone. Richard? Alexander's voice came out steadier than he felt. Do you have a moment? I need to discuss the Evans case. Hale paused, his expression flickering. The waitress? What about her? Discrepancies in the archived files. Signature issues, timeline problems. Oh, that. Hale's laugh was dismissive. Ancient history, Alex. Failed lawyers love to claim victimhood when they can't cut it. She couldn't handle the pressure, made unfortunate accusations, and we protected the firm's interests. Standard HR situation. The contempt was so casual it was almost worse than anger. Clara wasn't a person to him. She was a problem that had been solved and filed away. But the signatures, are you questioning how I handle personnel issues? Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. I've been practicing law longer than you've been out of diapers. I don't appreciate junior associates second-guessing senior partner decisions. Understood? Understood, Alexander heard himself say. Hale clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. Alexander stood in the hallway, feeling something shift inside his chest, a crack in the foundation he'd built his career on. Back in his office, he opened the folder, started cross-referencing dates. Clara Evans had been hired 6 years ago. Exemplary reviews for 18 months. Then, 3 months before termination, she'd filed an internal complaint about billing irregularities on a major development contract managed by Richard Hale. 2 weeks after her complaint, documentation issues appeared in her file. Small things, missed deadlines, communication errors, then bigger ones. She'd been terminated 60 days after her initial complaint. 3 days later, reported to the state bar. The evidence package had been compiled and signed by Richard Hale. Alexander pulled up the development contract Clara had questioned. A $100 million deal that had made quarterly earnings look spectacular. The client had known ties to political corruption. He found emails discussing alternative documentation and flexible interpretations, found suggestions to manage the paralegal, asking inconvenient questions. Every email chain included Richard Hale. The truth assembled itself like a puzzle he'd been avoiding. Clara hadn't failed. She'd been destroyed, systematically, deliberately, by a man who couldn't afford her questions to be taken seriously, and Alexander worked for him. The moral ground beneath his feet shattered completely. That evening he drove to Rainy Street Diner without consciously deciding to. Clara was wiping down tables when he entered. She saw him, and her expression hardened. I'm not here on behalf of the firm. Then why are you here? Because you were right. The words came out rough. About everything. About Hale. About what they did. I found the forged signatures, the timeline. All of it. Clara's hand stopped moving. Why are you telling me this? Because someone should have believed you 5 years ago. And I'm sorry I wasn't that person 2 weeks ago. Alexander set an envelope on the table. That's copies of everything I found. Do with it what you want. He walked out before she could respond. Outside, the evening air was cool. For the first time in days, Alexander could breathe properly. Across the street, Eli stood watching. When Alexander's eyes found him, the old judge nodded once. Acknowledgement, maybe approval. Clara remained inside, staring at the envelope like it might explode. Her hands shook as she picked it up, felt the weight of paper and possibility. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm systems moving in, the weather report had said. But Eli heard something else. The sound of sirens far away, building toward something 5 years in the making. The war that had ended Clara's first life was about to become a battle she might actually win. Richard Hale learned about Alexander's questions the way he learned everything, through networks of loyalty built on fear and favors. His assistant Trevor knocked on his office door at 4 in the afternoon. "Sir, I thought you should know. Alexander Price has been accessing archived files, specifically the Evans termination records." Hale didn't look up from his computer. "How long?" 3 days. "He's also run signature verification protocols." Now Hale looked up. His expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Thank you, Trevor. I'll handle it." After Trevor left, Hale sat motionless for a full minute. Alexander Price was ambitious, talented, and, until now, sufficiently compliant. But compliance was never permanent. It was merely the absence of sufficient motivation to rebel. He picked up his phone. "Trevor, come back in, and bring the Evans file." An hour later, Trevor emerged carrying a flash drive and instructions that made his hands shake. But Trevor had a mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and a wife who didn't know how precarious their life was. So he nodded and tried not to think about what he was about to do. By the next morning, rumors had begun circulating. Whispers in country clubs, murmurs at business lunches. "Did you hear about that waitress at Rainey Street? Apparently she's been blackmailing former clients, using confidential information she stole years ago." The rumors were specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to avoid legal challenge, and they spread with the speed of all good gossip. Clara was pouring coffee for the lunch rush when she noticed the police cars pull up outside. 2 unmarked sedans followed by a patrol unit. Her hand trembled, coffee sloshing in the pot, but she set it down carefully. She knew. Before they walked through the door, she already knew. Clara Evans. The detective was middle-aged, professional, not unkind. "We have a warrant to search these premises and your residence." "On what grounds?" Her voice came out steady despite the roaring in her ears. "Extortion, blackmail, possession of stolen confidential documents." He handed her the warrant. The diner fell silent. Every customer, every co-worker watching. Clara recognized the legal language, the carefully constructed allegations. This wasn't sloppy. This was professional character assassination. They searched efficiently, methodically. Clara stood outside under the awning, flanked by officers while customers gathered to watch. The humiliation was surgical, public enough to destroy her reputation, legal enough to prevent recourse. 30 minutes later, one of the officers emerged carrying a manila folder. Found these in her locker. Confidential client files, contract documents marked privileged. Clara's stomach dropped. "Those aren't mine. I've never seen." "Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked shut with terrible finality. Cold metal against her wrists. Around her faces she'd served coffee to every morning, stared with mixtures of shock and satisfaction. Sarah, her co-worker, looked away. Mr. Chen from the corner store shook his head. The shame hit harder than she'd expected. Being led to a police car, while neighbors whispered and phones captured video, this reopened wounds that had never properly healed. She kept her head up anyway. What else could she do? Alexander was in a meeting when he got the news alert. Local waitress arrested in blackmail scheme. He saw Clara's name and felt his blood turn to ice. He reached the police station to find Clara already in holding, sitting on a metal bench, still wearing her work uniform, staring at nothing with eyes that had gone somewhere far away. He wanted to burst through the door to fix this, but he knew the truth. He'd hesitated when it mattered. He'd found evidence days ago and done nothing but leave an envelope. This was partially his fault. At Price and Hale, Richard Hale poured himself scotch and watched the city lights flicker on. His phone buzzed with confirmations. Evidence found, arrest made, news picking up the story. Problem solved, he murmured to the empty room. Trevor entered. The client is satisfied. Of course they are. Hale turned, smiling. Clara Evans was a loose end. Now she's a cautionary tale. In the holding cell, Clara stared at concrete walls and felt the last threads of hope unraveling. She'd survived 5 years by telling herself the truth mattered, that justice would prevail. But innocence meant nothing against forged evidence and infinite resources. Her hands shook as she pulled out her old State Bar Association card, laminated and worn from years of carrying it like a talisman. Clara Evans, attorney at law. The title mocked her now. She tore it slowly, the plastic resisting before finally ripping. The pieces fell to the floor, and Clara put her face in her hands. The tears came silently. She'd lost. Again. Completely. Footsteps echoed outside. Clara didn't look up, didn't care who was coming. I need to speak with Clara Evans's defense attorney. The voice was raspy, elderly, but carrying unmistakable authority. Sir, visiting hours are... I'm Judge Elias Thornton, and if you value your career, you'll get me whoever is representing that woman immediately. Clara's head snapped up. Through the window she could see Eli standing with his umbrella and wearing an expression that commanded respect. The officer stammered. Judge Thornton, but you're back from the dead? Not quite. Eli's eyes found Clara's through the window. Tell whoever needs to hear it that a judge has come back from hell, and he's brought evidence. Alexander was gathering his briefcase when security called. Sir, there's a gentleman here. Says it's urgent. Name is Elias Thornton. The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Send him up. Eli stepped into his office, moving with careful dignity, clutching a waterproof envelope that had clearly been protected for years. He settled into the chair and set the envelope between them like a challenge. You've been asking questions, Mr. Price. I have answers. Alexander stared at the envelope. Judge Thornton, if you have evidence, I have everything. Eli's voice was quiet but absolute. Original emails, unaltered contracts, correspondence between Hale and his co-conspirators. All authenticated and dated. He pushed it across the desk. I've been carrying this for 4 years, waiting for the right moment. Alexander opened it with trembling hands. Inside were printed emails, each marked with metadata timestamps. Messages between Richard Hale and contractors discussing falsified reports. Conversations about managing the paralegal who'd noticed irregularities. Instructions on forging Clara's signature. The evidence was devastating. Irrefutable. Why didn't you come forward before? Alexander asked. Because I was broken. Eli's expression held old pain. I'd failed to stop this corruption from the bench. I drank myself into irrelevance rather than face what I'd let happen. But that young woman gave me her umbrella when I was nothing. She showed me kindness I didn't deserve. His eyes met Alexander's. She deserves better than what we've given her. Alexander felt guilt settle fully onto his shoulders. But beneath it was something else. Purpose. The possibility of redemption. I'll file an emergency motion to reopen the case. With this evidence, I can get her released. And your career? Eli asked. Then he destroys me. Alexander was already reaching for his phone. I'd rather be destroyed doing the right thing. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Alexander worked through the night, building a case file that was equal parts prosecution and confession. He documented everything, the forged signatures, the timeline, Hale's systematic destruction of evidence. At 6 a.m., he filed the motion. By 8, Clara was being transported to the courthouse. Alexander waited in the hallway as guards led her past. She looked exhausted, defeated. When she saw him, her expression hardened. Come to watch? I came to fix this. He held up the case file. I have everything. Proof that Hale set you up. I'm getting you out. Clara stopped walking. Why now? Where was this conviction 3 days ago? 5 years ago when I was drowning and no one believed me. You're right. Alexander didn't flinch. You needed someone to believe you when it mattered, and I didn't. I chose comfort over conscience. He stepped closer. But I can fix this. Not for forgiveness, I don't expect that. But because it's right. Even if I'm late doing it. Clara searched his face for deception. Found only exhaustion and genuine remorse. The hearing is in 30 minutes. Alexander continued. I've submitted evidence that should result in immediate dismissal and a formal investigation into Hale. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Alexander presented methodically. Eli testified, his credibility as a former judge lending weight. The prosecutor, seeing the evidence, didn't even try to defend the charges. Judge Martinez's expression grew darker with each revelation. When the last document was submitted, she removed her glasses. "Mr. Price, you realize this implicates your own firm in criminal conduct?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm prepared to testify fully." "You're aware this will likely end your career?" "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded slowly. "Then I commend your integrity, however belatedly discovered." She turned to Clara. "Ms. Evans, all charges are dismissed. On behalf of this court, I apologize for the injustice you've suffered." Clara stood, still not quite believing. The guards removed the handcuffs. She walked into the hallway where Alexander waited. "You doubted me when I needed you most," she said quietly. "I know, but you came back." Her voice cracked. "You risked everything. It shouldn't have taken me this long." She studied him, then extended her hand. "Thank you." Alexander took it, the gesture feeling both insufficient and monumentally significant. "I'll keep fighting until everything's fixed, until Hale faces consequences, even if it destroys you, especially then." Outside, Clara's mother Margaret waited, holding a dress she'd stayed up all night altering. When Clara emerged, Margaret swept her into a hug that smelled like lavender and home. By evening, news had spread. Waitress falsely accused by prominent law firm. The story was everywhere. Clara's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Thunder rumbled as evening gave way to night. Storm clouds gathered, familiar and almost comforting. Clara stood at her apartment window, watching lightning illuminate the city. The rain was coming, but this time, she wasn't afraid of it. The grand hall glittered like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirrors. Men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled beneath soaring ceilings, champagne flutes catching the light like small beacons of privilege. Price and Hale's annual charity gala was the social event of the season, a celebration of corporate philanthropy where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while networking for profit. The irony was thick enough to choke on, but no one seemed to notice. Clara stood at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm, trying not to feel like an imposter. The dress Margaret had altered fit perfectly, simple, elegant, dark blue that made her look like she belonged. But belonging was more than fabric and tailoring. "You don't have to do this," Alexander said quietly, sensing her hesitation. "Yes, I do." Clara's voice was steady. "He destroyed me publicly. I reclaim myself the same way." Beside them, Eli adjusted his borrowed suit, the first formal clothing he'd worn in years. Someone had trimmed his beard, and with his silver hair combed back, he looked like what he once was, a man of authority and consequence. "Shall we?" Eli offered his arm to Clara's other side. They walked in together, the disgraced waitress, the turncoat lawyer, and the ghost judge. Cameras flashed immediately. Reporters who'd been covering the scandal recognized them instantly. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Clara kept her head high, her expression calm. Each step forward felt like reclaiming territory that had been stolen from her. The crowd parted, uncertain whether to welcome or reject them, settling for curious observation. On the stage at the far end of the hall, Richard Hale stood at a podium, mid-speech. He wore his tuxedo-like armor, his smile practiced and warm, every inch the benevolent corporate leader. "Because at Price and Hale, we believe in ethical responsibility," he was saying. "Transparency isn't just a buzzword. It's the foundation of trust. Our clients deserve integrity, and that's what we deliver, every single day." The audience applauded politely. Hale basked in it, not yet noticing the disturbance near the entrance. Then someone near the front saw Clara. The whisper traveled like wildfire. Hale's eyes found her across the crowded hall, and for just a second, his mask slipped. Fear flashed across his features before the smile locked back into place. "Ah," he said into the microphone, attempting casual control. "I see we have some unexpected guests tonight. How interesting." Alexander started moving through the crowd, Clara and Eli flanking him. People stepped aside, creating a path whether they meant to or not. The energy in the room shifted. Anticipation, nervousness, the electric feeling that comes before something breaks. "Mr. Hale?" Alexander called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "Since you're speaking about transparency and integrity, perhaps we should test those words." He nodded to someone near the AV booth, a young man Clara didn't recognize, one of Alexander's former colleagues who'd believed the evidence, pressed a button. The decorative screens positioned around the hall flickered to life. Instead of the charity's promotional video, they displayed email threads. Hale's emails, time-stamped, authenticated, damning. "Reen Evans' problem. She's asking too many questions about the Riverside contract. We need to manage this before she talks to anyone outside the firm." Another screen lit up with audio files, Hale's voice playing through the sound system. "I don't care how you do it, Trevor. Make those signatures match. We cannot afford an investigation right now." The hall erupted in murmurs. Guests pulled out phones, some recording, others frantically texting. Investors who'd been glad-handing moments before suddenly looked uncomfortable, calculating their exposure. Hale's face had gone white. Someone has tampered with our private communications. This is illegal." "Actually," Eli's voice cut through the chaos, amplified as he took a microphone from a stunned waiter. "It's evidence, authenticated evidence that I personally verified before submitting to the district attorney's office." He held up a document with an official seal. "I may have been absent from the bench, but my authority to verify legal documents remains intact. These emails are real, Mr. Hale, as is the audio of you instructing your staff to forge signatures and destroy evidence." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Clara watched investors literally backing away from Hale, distancing themselves physically as if his corruption might be contagious. Board members of the charitable foundation huddled together, already planning damage control. Clara moved forward, taking the microphone Eli offered. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice came out clear and strong. 5 years ago, Richard Hale destroyed my career because I asked questions about billing fraud. He forged documents, fabricated misconduct, and used his position to make sure no one would believe me." She looked directly at Hale, holding his gaze. He thought he could bury the truth along with my reputation. But truth has a way of surviving, even when everything else is stripped away. The hall was silent now, everyone watching this woman in a simple blue dress speak with the authority of someone who'd already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "I'm not here for revenge," Clara continued. "I'm here because people need to know that power without accountability is just another form of theft. And Mr. Hale has been stealing. From clients, from justice, from anyone who threatened his carefully constructed lies. For far too long." Near the entrance, movement caught everyone's attention. District Attorney Morrison entered with 2 detectives, their presence official and undeniable. "Richard Hale," Morrison's voice carried across the hall. "You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Hale looked around wildly, as if the crowd of wealthy socialites might protect him. But they'd already melted away, creating distance, protecting their own reputations. He started toward a side exit, his composure finally shattering. He didn't make it 5 steps. The detectives intercepted him smoothly, professionally. The handcuffs clicked shut, the same sound Clara had heard on her own wrists days before. Now, under the glare of camera flashes and smartphone videos, Richard Hale was led through his own charity gala in handcuffs. The hall erupted in chaos, reporters shouting questions, guests fleeing or clustering in scandalized groups, the crash of someone's champagne flute hitting marble. Clara stood at the center of it all, feeling something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not quite peace, that would take time, but something close. Vindication, maybe, or simply the absence of that constant weight she'd carried, the burden of truth that no one would hear. The pressure in her chest, the one that had been there so long she'd forgotten what breathing freely felt like, finally began to ease. Alexander appeared at her side. "Are you okay?" Clara looked at him, then at Eli, then at the chaos around them. "I think," she said slowly, "I might actually be." The investigation into Price and Hale consumed the next 2 weeks like a wildfire through dry timber. Federal auditors arrived with boxes, computers were seized, clients fled to other firms, and partners scrambled to distance themselves from Hale's crimes. Alexander sat through 4 separate interviews with the State Bar Ethics Committee, each one more grueling than the last. They wanted to know what he knew, when he knew it, why he hadn't come forward sooner. His answers were honest, which meant they were damning. "I saw evidence of wrongdoing and hesitated because it threatened my career. I chose professional security over moral responsibility. The admission felt like swallowing glass, but he'd earned this discomfort. I was complicit through inaction. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Alexander signed his resignation letter. His hand didn't shake. The office he'd worked so hard to earn was already being packed by assistants who wouldn't meet his eyes. Some viewed him as a traitor, others as the only honest one among them. He didn't particularly care which. He had one more thing to do. Clara's apartment building looked different in daylight, less defeated maybe, or perhaps Alexander was just seeing it differently now. He climbed the 3 flights, knocked on her door, and waited with his heart hammering. She opened it wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, looking younger without the armor of professional clothing. They stood there for a moment, the space between them heavy with everything unsaid. "Can I come in?" Clara stepped aside without speaking. Her apartment was small but tidy, the late afternoon sun streaming through windows she'd clearly just cleaned. The leather folder containing her law degree sat on the coffee table, open. "I resigned today," Alexander said. "The Bar Association is reviewing my license. I'll probably face suspension, maybe disbarment." He met her eyes directly. "I'm telling you because I need you to know I'm not here to save my career or my reputation. Those are already gone." "Then why are you here?" "To apologize. Really apologize. Not the performative kind." He took a breath. "When I delivered that summons, I saw your reaction to Hale's name. I saw pain and fear, and somewhere inside I knew something was wrong. But I told myself it wasn't my problem. I saw the evidence of forgery and sat on it for days because I was afraid." His voice roughened. "I saw proof, Clara, but I didn't see you. I didn't see a person who'd been destroyed and was barely surviving. I saw a case file, a potential problem for the firm, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover that failure." Clara's expression was unreadable. Then her hand moved faster than Alexander could track, a sharp crack as her palm connected with his cheek. The sting was immediate and deserved. 5 years, she said, her voice shaking. 5 years I lived with everyone thinking I was a liar and a thief. 5 years of serving coffee to people who wouldn't look me in the eye, of carrying a law degree I couldn't use, of hating myself for failing when the only thing I failed at was trusting the system." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You could have helped sooner. You could have been brave when it would have actually saved me from that cell, from those handcuffs, from that humiliation." "I know." Alexander didn't raise his hand to his burning cheek. "You're absolutely right." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving with angry breaths. Then something in her face crumpled, and she was crying. Really crying. The kind of tears that come from 5 years of holding everything in. She took a stumbling step forward, and Alexander caught her as she collapsed against his chest. "I was so tired," she sobbed into his shirt. "So tired of being strong and alone and right without anyone believing me. I know, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Alexander held her carefully like she might break, feeling her shake with tears that had been earned through every injustice she'd endured. They stood like that for a long time, neither speaking, while Clara cried out years of pain and Alexander held her through it, knowing he'd helped cause this damage even if he was trying to help repair it now. Outside, on a bench across the street, Eli sat with his umbrella across his knees, watching the window. He couldn't see inside, but he could imagine, saw the shape of redemption beginning, fragile and imperfect. It was enough. He nodded to himself, satisfied. In Clara's mother's kitchen 3 blocks away, Margaret lit a candle in front of the window. The glass still cracked from where she'd hit it in frustration years ago when Clara came home in tears. She'd never fixed it, keeping it as a reminder of anger at injustice. Now she lit the candle in gratitude, watching the flame dance against broken glass. The evening paper lay on her table. Former Waitress exonerated law firm, partner arrested for fraud. The headline was everything Margaret had prayed for, everything she'd stopped believing would happen. Back in Clara's apartment, the crying had subsided to quiet hiccups. Clara pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I want to practice law again," she said, her voice raw but determined. "Really practice it. Help people who got crushed the way I did." "I'll help however I can," Alexander offered. "Contacts, references, financial backing for starting a practice. No." Clara's voice was firm. "Not salvation. Not you swooping in to fix everything because you feel guilty. Then what? Partnership. If you're serious about this redemption thing, about actually being better, then we work together. Equals. I bring the experience of surviving the system's worst. You bring knowledge of how it actually operates. We help people together." Alexander considered this. I'd be honored. Don't be honored yet. I'm still angry at you. Trust is going to take time. I know. I'm willing to put in that time, however long it takes. Clara studied him, looking for performance or manipulation, finding only tired sincerity. Okay then. Partners. She extended her hand. Alexander took it, and this time the gesture felt like a beginning. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke. But instead of the violent storms that had marked their earlier encounters, this was gentle, steady, and cleansing. The kind of rain that washes things clean, rather than destroying them. Clara moved to her window, watching water streak down the glass. Alexander joined her, and they stood there in comfortable silence while the city got its baptism. It's over, Clara said softly. Really over. The beginning of over, anyway. Alexander smiled slightly. There's still testimony, trials, rebuilding your reputation completely. It's not finished. No, Clara agreed. But for the first time in 5 years, I actually believe it will be. That's something. The rain continued falling, and somewhere in the sound of it hitting pavement was the promise of better things ahead. The office space was modest, 3 rooms on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades. Paint peeled near the ceiling corners, and the radiator clanked like it was arguing with itself. But the windows were large, letting in good light, and the rent was manageable. Most importantly, it was theirs. Clara stood in the center of the main room, holding a box of law books she'd kept hidden for 5 years. The sign painter had just left, and through the window she could see him packing his supplies. In gold letters on the glass, still wet and gleaming, were the words, Justice Restoration Project, Legal Aid for the Wrongfully Accused. It's perfect, Margaret said from the doorway, carrying cleaning supplies. She'd insisted on helping prepare the space, refusing to let Clara hire professionals. A little elbow grease, and this place will shine. Clara smiled, setting down the box. You don't have to do this, Mom. I can afford to. I know you can. Margaret was already tying an apron around her waist. But I spent 5 years watching you scrub other people's floors. Let me help you build something worth standing on. The funding had come together surprisingly quickly. An anonymous donation had covered the first year's rent and operational costs, enough to hire a paralegal and cover basic expenses. Clara suspected Alexander, though he'd denied it when she asked. The denial had been too quick, too careful. She'd let it go. Pride was expensive, and there were people who needed help more than she needed to prove her independence. Eli arrived an hour later, looking more substantial than he had as a homeless man, but still carrying that same umbrella. He'd found a small apartment, gotten clean, reconnected with a daughter who'd thought him dead, but he still moved like someone who'd learned not to take stability for granted. Counselor, he greeted Clara formally, his eyes twinkling. I'm here to volunteer my services, such as they are. Judge Thornton, your services are considerable. Clara gestured to a desk by the window. I was hoping you'd consult on case evaluation. Your experience would be invaluable. My experience is mostly in knowing what the system looks like from underneath, Eli said, but he was already moving toward the desk, running his hand over the wood like it was something precious. I suppose that's useful in its own way. They worked through the afternoon, Clara organizing files, Margaret scrubbing years of grime from windows, Eli reviewing the intake forms they'd developed. The space slowly transformed from forgotten office to functional practice, each person adding their particular brand of redemption to the foundation. By evening, journalists had found them. Clara watched from the window as a news van pulled up, reporter and cameraman emerging with that predatory eagerness that came with a good story. Want me to tell them to leave? Margaret asked. No, I'll handle it. Clara went downstairs, meeting them on the sidewalk before they could enter. I'm not giving interviews right now. The work speaks for itself. Ms. Evans, our viewers want to hear your story. My story is in the court records, public information. Clara's tone was polite but final. Right now I'm focused on helping other people tell theirs. Thank you for your interest. She went back inside before they could push further. Through the window she watched them film the exterior, the reporter speaking into the camera with animated gestures. Tomorrow there'd be a story, exonerated lawyer opens legal aid office, and more attention she didn't want. But that attention brought their first real client. James Morrison was a public defender who'd been suspended for allegedly leaking sealed juvenile records. He sat in Clara's office, still barely furnished, with the exhausted posture of someone who'd been fighting too long. I didn't leak anything, he said, But the prosecutor needed someone to blame when the case fell apart, and I was convenient. Clara read through his file, seeing patterns she recognized too well. Timeline inconsistencies, witnesses who changed stories, evidence that appeared and disappeared. Did you report any misconduct before your suspension? I questioned some plea deal practices, suggested internal review of case assignment patterns. James laughed bitterly. 3 weeks later, I'm facing ethics charges. Eli leaned forward from his position by the window. I remember your cases, Mr. Morrison. You were thorough. Inconvenient for people who preferred efficiency over accuracy. They took the case. Clara worked 16-hour days, rebuilding investigative skills she'd thought atrophied. Alexander provided quiet assistance, case law research, expert witness contacts, always at a distance, never claiming credit. 6 weeks later, they won. The ethics board cleared James completely, censured the prosecutor for misconduct, and reinstated his license with a formal apology. It wasn't just a victory, it was validation that the system could still work when someone pushed hard enough. The story went national. New legal aid group overturns wrongful suspension. Clara's phone rang constantly. Other lawyers in similar situations reached out. Law students asked about internships. Donors offered funding. Clara kept her head down and worked. Alexander watched from his own modest office across town, a solo practice now, taking cases nobody else wanted. He saw Clara on the news, poised and professional, deflecting personal questions to focus on the work. Pride swelled in his chest, mixed with lingering guilt that he'd almost been part of destroying this person. His phone rang. Clara's number. There's a fundraising dinner next month, she said without preamble, for the Justice Restoration Project. I'd like you to come. Alexander's hand tightened on the phone. Are you sure? I don't want to complicate things. You're already part of this story, Alexander. Might as well be part of the next chapter, too. A pause. Besides, I think we've reached the point where we're actually colleagues. Equals. Equals, Alexander repeated. I'm honored to be considered as much. Don't be honored. Be present. 7 o'clock, the Riverside Hotel. Dress respectfully but not ostentatiously. She hung up before he could respond, leaving him smiling at his phone like an idiot. The dinner was smaller than the charity gala where everything had exploded, maybe 80 people in a modest hotel ballroom. Donors, clients they'd helped, a few sympathetic judges and prosecutors. The atmosphere was warm, purposeful, nothing like the performative philanthropy of Price and Hale's events. Clara saw Alexander arrive and felt something settle in her chest. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing flashy, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found peace with reduced circumstances. When their eyes met across the room, she nodded slightly. He approached during cocktails, and they stood together near the windows overlooking the river. You've built something remarkable, Alexander said. We've built something, Clara corrected. Your contributions haven't gone unnoticed, even the anonymous ones. I don't know what you're talking about. Right. Clara's smile was genuine. Well, whoever anonymously paid for our case management software and paralegal salary has my gratitude. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights reflect on dark water. Now we can actually talk as equals, Clara said quietly. Not victim and rescuer, not guilty and vindicated, just two people doing work that matters. Alexander looked at her, really looked, taking in the woman who'd survived systematic destruction and built something better from the ruins. I've been trying to reach this level since the day I met you. Just took me too long to realize it. You got there eventually. Clara's hand found his, a brief squeeze. That counts for something. Behind them, Margaret watched from across the room, wiping tears she pretended were from allergies. Eli raised his water glass in their direction, a quiet toast to redemption earned. The past was still there. Wounds don't disappear completely. But standing together, watching the city that had witnessed both their failures and their reconstruction, it finally felt like something that belonged to yesterday rather than today. The weight of 5 years hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something bearable, even useful, a foundation instead of a burden. The courthouse steps were the same ones Clara had descended in handcuffs months before. Now she climbed them in a charcoal suit Margaret had pressed that morning, carrying a briefcase that had been a gift from the Justice Restoration Project's first donors. The sun was bright, almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Inside, the formal hearing room was packed. Clara recognized reporters, legal colleagues, some of the clients she'd helped. Margaret sat in the front row, hands clasped in her lap, looking like she was barely breathing. Judge Martinez presided, the same judge who'd dismissed the false charges. She looked at Clara with something approaching respect as the proceedings began. The court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and documentation pertaining to the case of the state versus Clara Evans. It is the finding of this court that Ms. Evans was not only innocent of all charges brought against her, but was herself the victim of systematic fraud, defamation, and obstruction of justice. Martinez's voice rang clear. This court formally and completely exonerates Clara Evans of all allegations. Her record is expunged, her reputation restored to its rightful standing. The room erupted in applause. Clara stood perfectly still, letting the words sink in. Exonerated, not just declared innocent, acknowledged as victimized. It was more than she'd expected, more than she'd let herself hope for. The state bar ceremony came the following week. Clara entered a conference room full of lawyers in formal attire, feeling like she was stepping back into a life she'd left for dead. The bar president, an older woman with kind eyes, held Clara's restored license. Ms. Evans, on behalf of the State Bar Association, I apologize for the injustice you suffered. Your license is hereby reinstated with full privileges, and our deepest regret for failing to investigate the allegations against you more thoroughly. She handed Clara the certificate. Welcome back to the legal profession. We're better for having you in it. The assembled lawyers applauded. Genuine applause, not polite obligation. Clara saw faces she recognized. Colleagues who'd avoided her 5 years ago, now looking guilty and relieved in equal measure. She accepted their recognition with grace she didn't entirely feel. That same afternoon, in a different courtroom, Richard Hale heard his sentence. 15 years for fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. His lawyers had argued for leniency based on his years of service to the community. The judge wasn't moved. You used your position of trust to destroy lives, the judge said. Ms. Evans was only one victim of your systematic corruption. This sentence reflects the gravity of your betrayal of the legal profession. Hale was led away in handcuffs, his face gray and aged beyond the months since his arrest. Clara wasn't there to witness it. She'd chosen not to attend, finding no satisfaction in watching someone else's destruction, even someone who'd destroyed her. Eli testified one final time at an ethics hearing reviewing judicial oversight failures. His testimony was measured, honest about his own failings while documenting systemic issues that had allowed corruption to flourish. When he finished, he quietly gathered his things and left through a side exit. Clara tried to find him afterward, wanting to thank him properly, but he'd vanished as completely as he'd appeared. She suspected he preferred it that way, his debt paid, his conscience eased, ready to live whatever remained of his life in earned peace. On a gray afternoon that threatened rain, Clara drove to the detention center where she'd been held. The building looked different in daylight, less imposing. She asked permission to see the holding cell, and the surprised guard escorted her to the familiar space. It was smaller than she remembered, less terrifying. Just a room with concrete walls and a metal bench, already holding someone else's temporary despair. Clara stood at the threshold, remembering the woman who'd torn her bar card here, who'd cried thinking everything was lost. She set a white rose on the bench, tribute to that woman who'd survived, acknowledgement of pain that had been real even if the charges weren't. Thank you, she whispered to her past self. You held on when I would have given up. Outside, Alexander waited by his car as promised. Light rain had started, barely more than mist. He held out an umbrella, not the cheap one she'd given Eli, but a nice one. Sturdy. Clara looked at it and laughed. Ready to start over? He asked, this time without the umbrella. She pushed it gently closed. I'm done hiding from the rain. They walked down the sidewalk together, rain dampening their hair and shoulders. Neither hurried. Puddles formed on uneven pavement, catching reflections of streetlights just beginning to glow in the early dusk. Each reflection looked like a small promise, light persisting even in dark water. At her apartment, Margaret stood at the window she'd finally had repaired. The new glass was clear, unmarred, letting her see the street without distortion. She watched her daughter walk with the man who'd helped save her, watched them laugh about something, watched Clara's face show peace instead of that terrible, careful guardedness she'd worn for 5 years. Margaret pressed her hand to the glass, warm from afternoon sun, and breathed out a prayer of gratitude. On the corner, a newspaper stand displayed the evening edition. The headline, visible even from a distance, proclaimed in bold letters, "Truth prevails. Lawyer's 5-year fight for justice ends in complete vindication." Below, in smaller text, Evans' case sparks review of legal ethics oversight. But Clara didn't see it. She was too busy walking through the rain with Alexander, discussing plans for the Justice Restoration Project's expansion, debating case strategies, arguing about hiring decisions with the comfortable friction of true colleagues. The rain fell steadily now, washing the city clean in that particular way evening rain does. Gentle, thorough, leaving everything glistening. Thunder rumbled somewhere distant, but it was the retreating kind. Storms already passed. "The truth doesn't stay silent," Alexander said, looking up at the darkening sky. "Not even in the rain." "Especially not in the rain," Clara corrected, smiling. "That's when it speaks loudest." They continued walking, two figures growing smaller in the distance, leaving footprints on wet pavement that the rain would eventually wash away. But what they'd built, what they'd fought for and earned, that would remain. The truth had survived, and so had she. 6 months after Clara's exoneration, the Justice Restoration Project received the National Legal Ethics Award, a prestigious recognition that came with significant funding and media attention. The ceremony was held in a downtown hotel ballroom, considerably nicer than their modest fundraising dinner had been. Clara stood at the podium accepting the crystal trophy, feeling surreal in a formal gown Margaret had insisted on buying. The applause was generous, the speeches complimentary, but what struck her most was the legitimacy of it all. She was being honored as a legal professional doing meaningful work, not just a victim who'd overcome. "This award belongs to everyone who believes the system can be better," Clara said into the microphone. "To the clients who trusted us, to the volunteers who gave their time, and to anyone who's fought for truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. Thank you." She stepped away from the podium, relieved to escape the spotlight. The reception was crowded with legal professionals and donors. Clara navigated it with practiced grace, answering questions about expansion plans and deflecting personal inquiries. She was discussing a law school partnership when she noticed Alexander standing near the entrance. He wasn't dressed for the event, just a simple suit, slightly rumpled. He held an envelope in his hands, turning it over nervously. Clara excused herself and crossed to him. "You came. I wasn't sure if I should." Alexander held out the envelope. "But I needed to give you this." Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from Price & Hale LLP, or what remained of it. The firm had been dissolved, assets liquidated, name stricken from the legal registry. The letter was Alexander's formal resignation, dated and notarized, making permanent what had been temporary. "It's really over," Clara said quietly. "That part of my life, yes." Alexander took a breath. "I want to start something new, something that actually matters." He met her eyes directly. "With you, not as separate practices that sometimes collaborate, but as actual partners, building something together." Clara started to respond, but Alexander was already moving, awkwardly, determinedly, down to one knee, right there in the hotel lobby. A few people nearby noticed, conversations faltering. "Clara Evans, will you—" "Alexander, what are you doing?" Clara's voice was half laughter, half panic. "Something I should have done months ago." He pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple silver band. "Will you marry me? Not because I'm trying to save you or because I feel guilty, but because working with you, fighting alongside you, watching you build something beautiful from ruins, it made me want to be part of your life in every way possible." Outside, rain had started. Light drops against the windows, pattering gently. Clara looked at Alexander kneeling there, genuine and vulnerable and slightly ridiculous, and felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep. "You picked the worst weather for this," she said. "It was in the rain that everything started." Alexander's smile was tentative, seemed appropriate to make it official the same way. Clara looked at the ring, then at his face, seeing not the polished lawyer who'd delivered that summons, but someone who'd been broken down and rebuilt into something more honest. This wasn't a fairy tale rescue or dramatic redemption. It was two people who'd both failed and learned and chosen to keep trying. "Yes," she said, "not because you're saving me or because this is some romantic ending, but because I respect you and I trust you now, and somewhere along the way I fell in love with the person you became." Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, his hands shaking slightly. He stood, and they embraced while the nearby crowd applauded, softer than the award ceremony applause, more genuine. Across the room, partially hidden behind a decorative column, Eli watched with satisfaction. He'd cleaned up well for the ceremony, his suit borrowed but respectable. He raised his water glass in a silent toast, then slipped toward the exit before anyone could draw him into conversation. His work here was done. Margaret saw the proposal from her seat near the refreshment table. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. The woman next to her offered a napkin, smiling knowingly. Margaret took it, dabbing at her eyes while watching her daughter, her strong, stubborn, brilliant daughter, finally allow herself to be happy. Outside, thunder rumbled. But it wasn't the threatening kind that had marked the beginning of Clara's ordeal. This was the sound of summer storms, the kind that cleared the air and left everything fresh. Through the windows, lightning flashed over the city, brief, brilliant, celebratory. Clara and Alexander stood together in the lobby, still holding each other, while people they'd helped and fought for and worked alongside congratulated them. The weight of the past wasn't gone. It never fully disappeared, but it had transformed into something bearable, even beautiful in its own scarred way. Margaret approached, pulling Clara into a fierce hug. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered. "I know, Mom. Not just of what you accomplished, of who you became while accomplishing it." Eli appeared briefly at the entrance, catching Clara's eye. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small salute, smiled, then disappeared into the rainy night. Clara understood. Some people were meant to witness transformation, not stay for the celebration. His presence had been a gift. His absence was another. The rain intensified, drumming against windows with steady rhythm. Inside, the reception continued, but Clara and Alexander found themselves gravitating toward the windows, watching water streak down glass. "Life is finally in balance," Alexander said quietly, "or at least heading that way." Clara leaned against him. "Still a lot of work to do, cases to win, people to help, a justice system that needs constant pushing toward actual justice." "Sounds exhausting. Sounds like purpose." Clara looked at the ring on her finger, simple and solid. "Sounds like something worth doing together." They stood there while the party continued behind them, watching the storm wash the city clean, both of them finally believing that tomorrow might actually be better than yesterday. 3 years later, Clara stood at the front of a lecture hall at the State University, chalk in hand, facing 60 eager law students. The course was legal ethics in practice, and it had a waiting list every semester. "The system isn't inherently just," she told them, writing key points on the board. "Justice is something we have to fight for constantly, in every case, every day. The moment you stop pushing, the system defaults to serving power instead of truth." A hand went up. "But Professor Evans, what do you do when fighting for justice costs you everything?" Clara set down the chalk, considering. "You decide what everything actually means. I lost my career, my reputation, 5 years of my life, but I didn't lose my integrity or my belief that truth matters. And ultimately, those were the things that let me rebuild." After class, she gathered her papers and headed across campus to the small office she shared with 2 other adjunct professors. On her desk sat the latest progress report from the Justice Restoration Project, now operating in 4 cities with a staff of 12 and a budget that allowed them to take on significant cases. Her phone buzzed. "Alexander. Running late. Client meeting went long." "See you at home?" Clara smiled, typing back. "Take your time. Dinner's in the slow cooker." Alexander's practice had grown steadily, pro bono work primarily, taking cases other firms wouldn't touch. He'd rebuilt his reputation not through clever marketing, but through consistent, honest advocacy for people who needed it most. He'd never make the money he'd made at Price and Hale, but he slept better. Across town, in a modest apartment filled with books and comfortable furniture, Eli sat at a desk finishing the final chapter of his memoir. The title page read, "Under the Umbrella of Justice, A Judge's Fall and Return." His publisher expected it to be controversial, a sitting judge's confession of failure and redemption. Eli expected it to be necessary. He typed the last sentence. "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice eventually served is evidence that the system, however flawed, can still be bent toward righteousness by those brave enough to push." Satisfied, he saved the document and stood, stretching. His daughter was coming for dinner, bringing his grandchildren. A life he'd thought lost forever, returned through the kindness of a stranger in the rain, and the second chance that kindness had sparked. In the suburbs, Margaret tended her garden, roses and vegetables growing in neat rows. Retirement suited her. She'd sold the old apartment and bought this small house with the settlement money from the lawsuit against Price and Hale's insurance. The garden was peaceful, productive, everything she'd hoped for after decades of worry. The Justice Restoration Project operated from a larger office now, 4 rooms instead of 3. On the wall of the main conference room hung a framed umbrella, cheap, weathered, the one Clara had given Eli that rainy night. Below it, a small plaque read, "Kindness changes destinies." Every new client who entered that room saw it. Some asked about it. Clara would tell them the story, how a small gesture had set in motion a chain of events that brought down corruption and rebuilt lives. How justice sometimes started with nothing more than seeing another person's need and choosing to help. Each case the project won felt like repairing another fragment of the past. A wrongfully disbarred attorney reinstated. A public defender cleared of fabricated ethics charges. A paralegal vindicated after being scapegoated. The work was endless, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. Clara and Alexander arrived home that evening to their small house, nothing fancy, but comfortable and theirs. The rain that had been threatening all day finally started as they pulled into the driveway. "Still calms you?" Alexander asked, noticing Clara pause to listen. "Always will." She tilted her face up, letting drops hit her skin. "Reminds me that storms end, that things get washed clean." Inside, they moved through comfortable routines, reheating dinner, discussing cases, planning weekend visits with Margaret. The normalcy of it still felt precious, earned rather than assumed. Later, curled on the couch with rain drumming steadily on the roof, Alexander commented, "Life has good memory. Brings things back around when you need them." Clara looked at him, then at the framed photograph on the mantel, her bar admission ceremony 3 years after her exoneration. Margaret beaming beside her, Eli in the background looking satisfied. "Justice has good memory too," she said. "Takes its time sometimes, but it remembers." The rain continued falling, no longer a symbol of struggle or hardship, but simply weather, necessary, cleansing, part of the natural cycle. Through the window, streetlights made the drops sparkle like small promises. Clara closed her eyes, listening. The sound that had once accompanied her lowest moment now accompanied peace. The umbrella she'd given away had somehow sheltered them all. Eli literally, but also metaphorically, creating connections that led to justice, redemption, and unexpected love. Outside, thunder rumbled gently. Inside, 2 people who'd been broken by injustice and rebuilt by truth sat together in comfortable silence. The past was still there, but it had become what it should be, a foundation rather than a prison, something to build on instead of something to escape. The rain fell steadily, washing the city clean one more time, and in that sound was the promise that tomorrow would come, and with it, more chances to push the world toward justice. Fade to the sound of rain, no longer threatening, no longer symbolic, just rain, doing what rain does, while life continued beneath its gentle percussion.